My name is James Callahan, 93 years old now, former sergeant in the 1st Marine Division, born and raised in a small town outside Boston. The cold at Chosin wasn't just weather, it was a living thing that hunted us alongside the Chinese. When they came at dawn, thousands of them pouring over the ridgeline like a human tide, I knew that most of us wouldn't make it home. We called ourselves the Frozen Chosin back then, but now they call us the Chosin Few. Not many of us left these days to tell what really happened there in North Korea. December 1950, when we faced the impossible and somehow lived. I grew up in Medford, just outside Boston, the son of a World War I veteran who never spoke about his time in France. My mother ran a small grocery store that somehow survived the Depression. We weren't rich, but we had more than most. I graduated high school in 1948, a time when most young men were trying to figure out what to do with their lives in this new peaceful world. Bobby, Sullivan, and I had been friends since we were kids. We lived on the same street, went to the same school, chased the same girls. Bobby was taller than me, with a crooked smile that somehow made people trust him instantly. He could talk his way out of anything, while I was the quiet one, the thinker. We should join the Marines, Bobby said. One day, as we sat on his front porch, drinking lemonade his mother had made. It was summer, hot and sticky, the kind of day that makes you believe nothing bad could ever happen in the world. Why the Marines? I asked. My old man was a Marine in the Pacific, says it made him the man he is. Besides, what else are we going to do around here? Work at the factory? Go to college with all those smarty pants types? I didn't have a good answer. My father wanted me to take over the family store someday, but the thought of spending my life behind that counter made something inside me shrivel up. I wanted adventure, to see places beyond Massachusetts, to test myself the way my father's generation had. 2 weeks later, we were at the recruitment office. The sergeant there, a Korean War veteran named Hastings, with a scar that ran from his ear to his chin, looked us up and down. "You boys think you've got what it takes?" he asked, not unkindly. "Yes, sir," we said in unison. "Well, we'll see about that." He pushed the paperwork across the desk. "Paris Island will either make Marines out of you or break you trying." My mother cried when I told her. My father just nodded, that same distant look in his eyes I'd seen whenever anyone mentioned the Great War. He clasped my shoulder once, hard, and said, "Do what your officers tell you, and watch out for the man next to you. That's how you come home." Paris Island was every bit as brutal as we'd heard. The drill instructors seemed to take a special pleasure in breaking us down to nothing before building us back up. Bobby and I made it through somehow, each pushing the other when one of us wanted to quit. By the end, we weren't just civilians playing at being soldiers. We were Marines. We had no way of knowing then that a place called Korea would soon dominate newspaper headlines, or that a frozen hell called the Chosin Reservoir waited for us on the other side of the world. We were young, immortal, ready to prove ourselves in a way our fathers had in their war. The news of North Korea invading South Korea reached us in Japan, where we'd been stationed since completing our training. It was June 1950, and suddenly the peacetime Marine Corps transformed overnight. Training intensified. Equipment was checked and rechecked. The old salts, the veterans of World War II, got a certain look in their eyes, part excitement, part dread. They knew what was coming. We didn't. "We're heading in," Bobby said, sitting on his bunk, cleaning his rifle for the 3rd time that day. Finally gonna see if all this training was worth a damn. I nodded, feeling a knot in my stomach that I wouldn't admit to anyone, not even Bobby. We'd signed up for adventure, for the challenge, for the brotherhood. Now war was coming, real war. And I wondered if we were ready. We landed at Incheon in September as part of the 1st Marine Division. The landing itself was a masterpiece, catching the North Koreans by surprise. Within our unit, we quickly came to know the men whose lives would be intertwined with ours. Lieutenant Frank Morris was our platoon leader, a Naval Academy graduate with a serious face and thoughtful eyes. He was older than most lieutenants, having served as an enlisted man. In World War II, before getting his commission, he didn't say much, but when he did, everyone listened. "Gentlemen," he told us, after we'd secured our position that first night on Korean soil. This isn't the war you've seen in movies. Keep your heads down, follow orders, and we'll get through this together. Staff Sergeant Walter Thompson Walt, to his friends, was a mountain of a man from Tennessee, with hands like bear paws and a voice that could cut through the chaos of battle without ever seeming to yell. He'd fought at Okinawa and carried the memories of that bloody battle in the lines around his eyes. "You boys stick close to me," he drawled. "I didn't survive the Japs to lose any of you to these communist bastards." Corporal Henry Miller, our squad leader, a farmer's son from Iowa with a perpetual sunburn and squinty eyes that missed nothing. He had a talent for navigation that seemed almost supernatural and a dry sense of humor that kept morale up during the worst times. "Korea's just like Iowa," he'd joke, gesturing at the rugged mountains surrounding us. "If you flattened Iowa, then crumpled it up like paper." PFC George Patterson was our radio man, a skinny kid from Philadelphia with glasses and a lightning-quick mind. He could fix any communication equipment with chewing gum and wire if he had to, and he carried his radio like it was his child. PFC Raymond Johnson was our corpsman doc, as all Navy medics assigned to Marine units are called. Quiet, steady, with gentle hands and fierce eyes, he carried more medical supplies than regulation required, often lightening his food load to make room for extra bandages and plasma. "Rather be hungry than watch one of you bleed out," he said simply when questioned about it. And then there was Private Thomas Clark Tomagist 18, and the newest addition to our squad. He had that fresh-faced eagerness that made the veterans shake their heads, knowing it wouldn't last. He showed us pictures of his high school sweetheart and talked about marrying her when he got home. Korea itself was a shock. The smells, the poverty, the rugged terrain that made every movement an effort. The South Korean civilians watched us with eyes that had seen too much already, some grateful, others wary, all of them tired of war in their homeland. As we pushed north following the Incheon landing, none of us imagined what awaited us near the Chinese border. We were Marines. We were winning. What could possibly stop us? The push northward felt like a victory march at first. The North Korean army was in retreat, and we advanced rapidly. Seoul was recaptured, and we kept moving, crossing the 38th parallel into North Korea itself. There was talk among the ranks about being home by Christmas. The war, many believed, was all but won. "Too easy," Bobby said one night as we huddled around a small fire, the mountains of North Korea rising around us like the walls of a prison. "Something doesn't feel right about it." "Don't jinx it, Sullivan," Hank said, cleaning the mud from his boots. "I'll take an easy win any day." "Nothing easy about Korea," Walt interjected, his voice low and gravelly. He'd been unusually quiet during the advance. "Terrain's a bitch, weather's turning cold, and our supply lines are stretching thin. We're moving too fast, if you ask me." Lieutenant Morris overheard this as he approached our fire. He squatted down, warming his hands. "Thompson's right. Division's concerned about the same things, and there's something else." He paused, looking around at our faces, illuminated by the flickering flames. "Intelligence reports Chinese forces massing at the Yalu River." A silence fell over our group. China entering the war would change everything. "Are they sure, sir?" I asked. Morris shrugged. "Aerial reconnaissance has spotted some movement. Refugees have reported Chinese troops crossing the border, but High Command isn't convinced they'll actually intervene. General MacArthur believes the Chinese are bluffing." "With all due respect to the general," Walt said, "he's not the one who will be facing them if they do come." As we pushed closer to the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China, the weather began to turn. October brought colder temperatures, and by early November, a bitter chill had settled over the mountains. We were issued cold weather gear, but much of it was left over from World War II and inadequate for the harsh Korean winter that was approaching. Our advance continued, though at a slower pace as the terrain became more challenging and resistance stiffened. Small groups of North Korean soldiers would strike in hit-and-run attacks, then disappear into the mountains. It was frustrating, deadly work. Tommy Clark took his first life during one of these skirmishes. A North Korean soldier who popped up from behind a rock just 20 yards away, Tommy's shot caught him in the chest. Afterward, I found Tommy sitting alone, staring at his hands. "You okay?" I asked, sitting beside him. "Yeah," he said, not looking up. "Just different than I thought it would be. What's that?" "Killing someone." He finally looked at me, his young face suddenly much older. It wasn't like the movies or the training. He just crumpled, made a sound I'll never forget. I nodded, remembering my own first kill weeks earlier. It never gets easy. It shouldn't get easy, but you did what you had to do. He would have killed you, or one of us, if you hadn't fired first. "I know," Tommy said. "I know that here." He tapped his head. Just having trouble making the rest of me understand. As we pushed further north, reaching the area near the Chosin Reservoir by mid-November, the first snowfall came. Light at first, then heavier. The temperature plummeted. We began to encounter something new as well: Chinese prisoners. Not many, just a few soldiers who claimed to be volunteers. But their presence confirmed what many of us had feared. China had entered the war, yet still we advanced. Deeper into the mountains, farther from our supply bases, extended in a long, vulnerable line as the snow continued to fall and the temperature continued to drop. We were heading into a trap, though none of us fully realized it then. The first real warning came on a patrol in late November. We were scouting a ridgeline about 3 miles from our main position, looking for any signs of enemy movement. The snow was falling steadily, limiting visibility and muffling sound. The cold had become our constant enemy, seeping into our bones, making every movement an effort. George Patterson, our radio man, spotted them. First a group of soldiers moving through a ravine below us. They weren't North Koreans. Their uniforms were different, their discipline obvious even from a distance. "Chinese," Walt whispered, peering through his binoculars. "Full battalion strength, maybe more." Lieutenant Morris carefully observed them for several minutes before ordering us to withdraw. "We need to report this immediately." Back at base, Morris made his report to company command, who passed it up the chain. The response that came back stunned us all. "They're saying it's just a reconnaissance unit," Morris told us, his frustration evident. "They don't believe it's evidence of large-scale Chinese involvement." "That was no recon unit," Walt said flatly. "Those were frontline troops, and plenty of them." Similar reports were coming in from other patrols. Marines and Army units all along the line were encountering Chinese forces, yet higher command continued to downplay these sightings. General MacArthur remained convinced that China would not fully commit to the war, that these were limited units sent only to intimidate. The temperature continued to drop, reaching well below zero at night. Our equipment began to fail. Rifle lubricant froze, causing weapons to jam. Vehicle batteries died. The ground became so hard we couldn't dig proper foxholes without using explosives first. We took to sleeping in our boots, for fear they'd freeze solid overnight if we removed them. "This cold is going to kill us before the Chinese get a chance," Bobby said one night as we huddled together for warmth. "Keep moving," I advised, having learned that staying still was a quick path to frostbite. "Wiggle your toes every few minutes. Keep your blood flowing." The tension built as more reports of Chinese forces came in. Some Marines claimed to hear bugles and whistles at night, classic Chinese army signals. Others reported seeing campfires on distant ridges where no fires should be. Doc Johnson found me one evening as I was checking my rifle for the 100th time, making sure the bolt would still move despite the cold. "How's the finger?" he asked, referring to a mild case of frostbite I'd developed on my trigger finger. "Still attached," I said, flexing it to show him. He nodded, then lowered his voice. "I was with the corpsman meeting earlier. Medicals preparing for mass casualties. They're not saying it outright, but they're expecting something big. Chinese, that's my guess. They've requisitioned all available blood plasma and expanded the aid stations. Someone knows something they're not telling the rest of us." That night, I wrote a letter to my parents, trying to sound upbeat despite the growing dread I felt. I didn't mention the Chinese or the extreme cold. Instead, I wrote about the beauty of the Korean mountains, the camaraderie among the men, and my hopes to be home by spring. I sealed the letter, knowing it might be my last. Tommy Clark caught me after I'd finished writing. His boyish face was pinched with cold and worry. "Callahan," he said hesitantly, "you've been in longer than me. Do you think we're in trouble here?" I wanted to reassure him, to play the role of the experienced Marine comforting the rookie. But something in his eyes told me he deserved the truth. "Yeah, Tommy, I think we might be. But we're Marines. Whatever comes, we face it together. That's how we get through." He nodded, seeming older suddenly. "My dad was at Below Wood in the First War. He said sometimes all you can do is dig in and hold on." "Your dad sounds like a smart man," I replied. "We should follow his advice." The next day, Lieutenant Morris called our squad leaders together. His face was grim as he spread a map on the hood of a jeep. "Division is finally acknowledging the Chinese presence," he said, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "But they still believe it's limited. We're to maintain our positions and prepare for potential probing attacks." "Probing attacks?" Walt questioned. "Sir, with all due respect, what we're seeing suggests a lot more than probing." Morris met his gaze. Steadily. "I know, Thompson. I've passed that up the chain. For now, we follow orders and prepare as best we can." As we dispersed, I caught a look between Morris and Walt. A silent communication between two men who'd seen enough war to recognize the signs of impending disaster. It sent a chill through me far colder than the Korean winter. Thanksgiving arrived with a brief respite from the tension. Despite the circumstances, efforts had been made to provide something resembling a holiday meal. Turkey, mashed potatoes, and gravy were flown in, though they were nearly cold by the time they reached us. Still, it was a touch of home in that frozen wilderness. We gathered in a makeshift mess area, our breaths visible in the frigid air as we ate from metal trays. The mood was surprisingly light, as if we'd all silently agreed to set aside our fears for a few hours. "Best meal I've had since joining this man's Marine Corps," Hank declared, shoveling potatoes into his mouth. "That's not saying much," Bobby quipped, which earned a round of laughter. Lieutenant Maurice joined us, something he rarely did. He seemed to have aged years in the past weeks, the responsibility of command etching new lines around his eyes. "Mail came in with the food," he announced, producing a bundle of letters. A cheer went up as he began distributing them. "I received 2 letters, one from my parents and one from my younger sister." I read them slowly, savoring this connection to a world that seemed increasingly distant. My mother wrote about neighborhood, gossiped my father about the store. My sister had enclosed a photo of herself in her nursing school uniform. Such ordinary things, yet they felt like treasures. As evening approached, conversation around our group turned reflective. Tommy pulled out a harmonica and played a halting version of Silent Night, which felt oddly appropriate despite being a month early for Christmas. "My turn for a story," Walt announced when Tommy finished playing. It was unusual for Walt to volunteer anything personal, so we all quieted immediately. "Thanksgiving 1944, I was on Peleliu," he began, his voice low. "One of the bloodiest fights in the Pacific, but by November, we'd secured most of the island. Still had Jap snipers in the hills taking shots at us. We scrounged up what food we could, even managed to get some turkey somehow. Right in the middle of our meal, a sniper opens up, hits the guy next to me." He paused, taking a drink from his canteen. "We got the sniper, got our wounded guy to the aid station. Then you know what we did? Went back and finished our damn dinner. That's what Marines do. We adapt, we overcome, and when possible, we finish our turkey." There was a moment of respectful silence before Bobby raised his canteen cup to finishing the meal, no matter what. "No matter what," we echoed, raising our cups. Doc Johnson shared next, telling us about growing up in rural Mississippi, the son of a country doctor who made house calls by horseback well into the 1940s. "My old man could diagnose just about anything. With a stethoscope, a thermometer, and his 5 senses," Doc said proudly. "Taught me that medicine isn't just about knowing procedures, it's about knowing people. That's why I carry extra supplies. Each of you is different. What works for Callahan might not work for Sullivan. George Patterson, usually reserved, surprised. us by revealing he'd been a radio operator for his grandfather's amateur station since he was 12. Gramps was a ham radio enthusiast, he explained. Taught me Morse code before I could read properly. During the war, World War II, we'd listen to shortwave broadcasts from Europe, trying to piece together what was really happening. That's when I knew communications would be my life. Even Lieutenant Morris opened up, telling us about his decision to remain in the Marines after World War II when many were leaving for civilian life. My father was career Army, he said. Fought in the First World War, stayed in, trained troops for the Second. He always said peacetime was when you prepared for war, not when you forgot about it. I believed him, still do. As night fell and temperatures plummeted further, we reluctantly broke up our gathering. The brief camaraderie had been a welcome distraction, but reality was setting in again. The wind had picked up, howling between the tents and vehicles. Carrying the promise of more snow, I found Bobby standing alone at the perimeter, staring out into the darkness. "What do you see out there?" I asked, joining him. "Nothing," he replied. "That's what worries me. Too quiet. Like everything's holding its breath." I nodded, feeling the same unease. The mountains around us loomed as dark shadows against the night sky. Somewhere out there, thousands of Chinese soldiers were waiting. We both knew it, even if headquarters still didn't fully accept it. "Remember when we thought joining the Marines was going to be a great adventure?" Bobby asked with a wry smile. "Yeah," I chuckled. "Careful what you wish for, right?" We stood in companionable silence for a few minutes. Two friends from Medford, who'd never imagined they'd end up in this frozen corner of Korea. "Whatever happens," Bobby said finally, "I'm glad you're here with me. Jim?" "Same," I replied simply. Little did we know that within 72 hours, our world would erupt into chaos, and the true test of our Marine Corps' training and our friendship would begin. November 27th, 1950. I'll never forget that date. The temperature had dropped to about 20 below zero. The wind cut through our layers like they were nothing. We'd been on heightened alert for days, with more reports of Chinese troop movements filtering in. Despite this, the higher-ups still hadn't fully accepted the reality of what we were facing. I was huddled in my foxhole with Bobby, both of us taking turns keeping watch while the other tried to get some sleep. It was around 10 p.m. when we heard the faint sound of bugles in the distance. "You hear that?" Bobby whispered, suddenly alert. "Yeah," I replied, a chill running down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The bugles grew louder, joined by whistles and the muffled sound of thousands of footsteps in the snow. Then flares lit up the sky, illuminating a sight that haunts me to this day. Wave after wave of Chinese soldiers coming down the ridgelines toward our position. "My God," Bobby breathed. "There's thousands of them." I grabbed our squad radio while Bobby opened fire. "Checkpoint Charlie to command. Chinese attack in force. North Ridge, 100 to know. Thousands of troops. Request immediate support." All along our line, Marines were opening fire. The night erupted with muzzle flashes, the crack of rifles, and the heavier thump of machine guns. The Chinese kept coming, not in scattered groups, but in coordinated waves. When one line fell, another immediately took its place. "Conserve ammo." Walt shouted somewhere to our right. "Make every shot count." Tactics sending masses of infantry directly at our positions, absorbing tremendous casualties but maintaining momentum through sheer numbers. They'd close to grenade range, then fall back, only to attack again from another direction. Lieutenant Morris moved constantly behind our line, directing fire, encouraging men, organizing impromptu defensive positions as the original ones were. Overrun, I caught glimpses of him in the flare light, his face set with grim determination. "Shift fire, right." He ordered as a new wave appeared. "Patterson, get battalion on the radio. Tell them we need artillery support now." George worked frantically with the radio, which was functioning intermittently in the extreme cold. "They're saying all units are under attack," he reported. "Artillery is spread thin." The fighting was chaotic, desperate. In the flashes of explosions and flares, I saw Marines locked in hand-to-hand combat with Chinese soldiers who had breached our lines. The cries of wounded men from both sides filled the air between bursts of gunfire. Doc Johnson moved from position to position, treating the injured despite the danger. I watched him drag a wounded Marine to cover while bullets kicked up snow around him. Tommy Clark was at a machine gun position about 20 yards from our foxhole. He fired in controlled bursts, just as we'd been trained, cutting down rows of attacking soldiers. Then I saw a group of Chinese flanking his position. "Tommy, on your left," I shouted. He swung the machine gun around, but too late. A Chinese grenade landed in his position. There was a flash, a bang, and Tommy was thrown backward. Bobby and I provided covering fire while Doc rushed to him. I couldn't hear what Doc said to Lieutenant Morris after examining Tommy, but the grim shake of his head told us everything. Tommy Clark, 18 years old, from a small town in Ohio, with a high school sweetheart waiting for his return, was gone. There was no time to mourn. The Chinese kept coming, wave after wave. Our ammunition was running low. The radio crackled with reports of other units in similar situations, surrounded, outnumbered, fighting for their lives. "We need to fall back to the secondary position," Lieutenant Morris ordered after conferring with company command. "Thompson, organize covering fire. We'll withdraw by squads." Walt nodded and began directing teams of Marines to provide suppressing fire while others retreated. It was a textbook withdrawal under fire, executed with the discipline that separated Marines from less trained troops. Bobby and I were among the last to pull back, providing covering fire for Walt and the lieutenant. As we ran through the snow to the new position, the sky lit up with artillery hours, finally responding to the desperate calls for support. Shells rained down on the Chinese advance, buying us precious time to regroup. Our new position was more defensible, with better fields of fire. We quickly organized, redistributing ammunition, tending to the wounded as best we could. The Chinese attacks continued through the night, but with less coordination. Our artillery had disrupted their momentum by dawn. The immediate area around our position was littered with Chinese casualties. The snow was stained red in the growing light. We had held, but at a cost. Nearly a third of our platoon was dead or wounded. Tommy was one of 5 from our squad alone who wouldn't see another sunset. As the first rays of light crept over the mountains, the Chinese attacks subsided. We used a respite to check weapons, count remaining ammunition, and evacuate the wounded where possible. No one spoke much. The shock of what we had faced and what we had survived left us in a stunned silence. Lieutenant Morris moved among us, checking on his men. When he reached Bobby and me, he paused. "You two did good work tonight," he said simply. "Thank you, sir," Bobby replied. "What happens now?" Morris looked out at the mountains, his expression unreadable. "Now we prepare, because they'll be back, and next time they'll bring more." I remember thinking that nothing could be worse than what we'd just experienced. I was wrong. That first night was just the beginning of our ordeal at Chosin. The day after the first attack brought no real relief. We used the daylight hours to improve our positions, redistribute ammunition, and tend to the wounded. The temperature remained brutally cold, hovering around 20 below zero. The dead both ours and theirs froze, solid where they fell. Tommy's death hit our squad hard. He'd been the youngest, the one with the most life ahead of him. Hank Miller took it especially badly. He'd taken Tommy under his wing since the kid joined our unit. "I told him to keep his head down," Hank said as we worked to fortify our new position. "Told him 100 times. "Wasn't your fault," I said. "He was doing his job. We all are." Word came down that we weren't alone in being hit hard. The entire Chosin area was under attack by at least 8 divisions of Chinese troops, possibly more than 120,000 men against our roughly 30,000 Marines and Army units. We were effectively surrounded, with Chinese forces controlling the high ground on all sides. Commands trying to coordinate a defense, Lieutenant Morris informed us after, returning from a meeting with company leaders. The 1st Marine Division is going to consolidate positions around Hagaruri, Kotari, and Utaminai. We need to hold until that happens. Hold against 8 divisions. George Patterson asked, his voice quiet but incredulous. "We're Marines, Walt," said firmly. Holding against impossible odds is what we do. As dusk approached, tension built again. Everyone knew the Chinese preferred to attack at night. We checked and rechecked our weapons, fighting against the cold that threatened to freeze rifle bolts and render them useless. I had learned a trick from a World War II veteran before we shipped out. I kept a small piece of cloth soaked in oil inside my shirt, close to my body heat. When my rifle mechanism started to stiffen, I'd apply a tiny amount of the warmed oil. I showed Bobby and others in our squad. Just a drop, I cautioned. Too much oil will attract dirt and freeze worse. The Chinese attack that night was different. From the first, instead of the massive human waves, they sent smaller, more coordinated groups, probing for weaknesses. They'd found that direct assaults against Marine firepower, even with superior numbers, resulted in devastating casualties. They're learning, Lieutenant Morris observed grimly. For hours, we fought off these probing attacks. The Chinese would appear suddenly out of the darkness, strike hard at a section of our line, then disappear before we could bring our full firepower to bear. It was nerve-wracking, exhausting work. Around midnight, a larger Chinese force hit the position to our right, where a platoon from Baker Company was dug in. The sound of intense fighting erupted, with calls for help coming over the radio. "Thompson, take 2 squads to reinforce Baker's position," Lieutenant Morris ordered. "The rest of us will hold here." Walt selected our squad and 1 other. We moved quickly through the snow, staying low. The fighting grew louder as we approached. Baker Company was in serious trouble, nearly overrun by a determined Chinese assault. We hit the Chinese flank hard, catching them by surprise. Our disciplined fire tore through their ranks, forcing them to redirect some of their attack toward us. This gave Baker Company the breathing room they needed to reorganize their defense. The fighting was intense, often hand-to-hand in the darkness. A Chinese soldier appeared suddenly before me, his bayonet aimed at my chest. I barely deflected it with my rifle, the blade slicing through my parka sleeve and drawing blood. I drove my combat knife into his throat before he could strike again. Bobby fought beside me, his movements sure despite the chaos. We'd trained together so long that we anticipated each other's actions, covering each other instinctively. "Behind you," he shouted at one point, firing over my shoulder at a Chinese soldier I hadn't seen. The battle for Baker's position lasted nearly 2 hours before the Chinese finally withdrew. We'd held, but at a cost. 3 Marines from our squad were wounded, and 1 killed. Baker Company had lost nearly half their effective fighting force, as we helped evacuate the wounded to the aid station. I saw Doc Johnson working frantically to save a young Marine who'd taken shrapnel to the neck. Despite Doc's efforts, the Marine died under his hands. "Goddamn it," Doc muttered, his face splattered with blood, frozen to his skin. "That's 4 I've lost tonight." "You saved twice that many," I told him, but he just shook his head and moved to the next wounded man. Dawn came again, revealing the carnage of the night's fighting. The snow was churned up and bloodied, bodies frozen in grotesque positions. We trudged back to our original position, exhausted beyond words. Lieutenant Morris was waiting for us. His left arm was bandaged where a bullet had grazed him, but he'd refused evacuation. "Get some rest while you can," he ordered. 2 hours on, 2 hours off. They'll be back tonight. I collapsed in my foxhole, too tired even to feel the cold. Bobby slumped beside me, his eyes already closing. Neither of us spoke. What was there to say? We'd survived another night, but how many more could we endure? When I awoke, Walt was standing over me, offering a canteen with water he'd managed to keep from freezing by carrying it against his body. "Command's finally accepted reality," he said. As I drank, "They know we're surrounded by at least 8 Chinese divisions now. So what's the plan?" I asked, passing the canteen to Bobby, who was stirring beside me. "Hold until they figure one out," Walt replied with a grim smile. Marine Corps tradition when surrounded, attack in all directions. Later that day, we received word that the 1st Marine Division commander, General Smith, had issued new orders. We weren't retreating, we were attacking in a new direction, south, toward the port of Hungnam. "We're going to have to fight our way out," Lieutenant Morris explained to us. Every step of the way. As night fell again, I looked at the faces of the men around me. Bobby, Walt, Hank, George, Dockel, exhausted, cold, some wounded, but none broken. We were Marines. Whatever came next, we would face it together. The bugle calls began just after midnight. The cold became our most relentless enemy. By the end of November, temperatures plunged to 30 below zero. Men who fell asleep without moving occasionally would wake to find their clothing frozen to the ground. I saw Marines cry out in pain as they tore patches of skin away, just trying to stand up. Equipment failures plagued us constantly. Rifle lubricant congealed into a useless gel. Morphine syrettes had to be warmed in medics' mouths before they could be used on the wounded. Radio batteries died within hours instead of days. Vehicle engines refused to start without fires being lit beneath their oil pans. "This cold is something else," Bobby said one morning, his words barely intelligible through chattering teeth. His face was gaunt, with a layer of frost clinging to his stubble. None of us had been able to shave for days. "Breathe through your nose, not your mouth," I reminded him. "Less moisture lost that way." We developed routines to combat the cold. Every hour, we'd remove our boots and massage our feet, checking for the telltale white patches of frostbite. We'd stuff newspapers when we could get them between layers of clothing for insulation. We learned to sleep in short bursts, never staying still long enough for the cold to take hold. Doc Johnson moved constantly among us, checking for frostbite cases. "Wiggle your toes every 15 minutes, he'd remind everyone. "I don't care if you're in the middle of a firefight. Wiggle your damn toes." Our rations froze solid. Sea rations had to be thawed against our bodies before they could be eaten. Water in canteens turned to ice within minutes of being filled. Some men took to carrying snow inside their clothing, using body heat to melt it when they needed a drink. The extreme cold affected our weapons most critically. I became obsessive about my rifle, breaking it down and cleaning it multiple times, daily. I showed others my trick with the oil-soaked cloth kept warm against my body. But even that wasn't foolproof. During one Chinese attack, Hank Miller's rifle froze up completely. He switched to his pistol, firing until its mechanism also seized. I watched in horror as he resorted to using his rifle as a club, smashing it against the head of a Chinese soldier who had breached our line. "Here," I shouted, tossing him my pistol while I continued firing my rifle. Later, when things quieted down, Hank returned my pistol. "Thanks," he said simply. "I owe you one." "Just keep it working," I replied. We both knew a functioning weapon meant the difference between life and death. Sleep deprivation compounded our misery. Between the cold, the constant alerts, and the nighttime attacks, most of us averaged perhaps 2 hours of broken sleep per day. Men began to hallucinate, seeing things that weren't there, hearing phantom voices in the wind. Lieutenant Morris recognized the danger and instituted strict rest rotations. "A Marine who can't think straight is a danger to himself and everyone around him," he insisted. Still, we persevered. Marines adapted. We learned to beat the cold by sheer force of will and ingenuity. Those who couldn't adapt didn't survive. Walt Thompson seemed almost immune to the conditions. The big Tennessean moved through the frozen landscape like he'd been born to it, helping others, sharing techniques he'd learned. "Cold's just another enemy," he drawled, "and we don't let enemies win." I believed him. Despite everything, the brutal temperature, the equipment failures, the constant fighting, we were still Marines, still unbroken. And as dawn broke on November 30th, we prepared to face the worst challenge yet, the massive human wave attack that would determine whether we lived or died at Chosin. They came at dawn on November 30th, not under cover of darkness like before, but in the gray morning light, as if they wanted us to see their full strength. Thousands of Chinese soldiers poured over the ridgelines, a dark mass against the white snow, moving with coordinated purpose. "Jesus Christ," Bobby whispered beside me. "There's no end to them." The human wave attack was unlike anything I'd experienced, before or since. It wasn't just about numbers, though the Chinese had those in abundance. It was a psychological impact seeing an enemy so willing to sacrifice themselves by the hundreds, that they would walk directly into machine gun fire without hesitation. The bugles started first, that eerie alien sound echoing across the frozen landscape, then whistles, hundreds of them, signaling the advance. The ground seemed to vibrate with the footsteps of thousands of men moving as one. "Hold your fire," Lieutenant Morris ordered, moving calmly behind our line. "Wait until they're within 200 yards. Make every shot count." I focused on my breathing, trying to steady my hands. The Chinese advanced methodically, not running, but walking steadily forward. Their first line carried no weapons, only grenades strapped to their bodies. Behind them came riflemen, then machine gun teams. "Fire," Maurice finally commanded when the front ranks entered our killing zone. Our entire line erupted. Machine guns swept deadly arcs through the Chinese ranks. Mortar dropped with precision on their densest formations. Our rifles cracked in a continuous, deafening chorus. The first wave disintegrated under our fire, bodies crumpling to the snow by the dozens, then hundreds. But the second wave stepped over their fallen comrades without breaking stride. Then, the third wave, and the fourth. "Keep firing," Walt bellowed. "Don't let up." The Chinese tactics became clear. They would absorb our fire with their front ranks, depleting our ammunition, while their follow-up waves closed the distance. It was brutally effective and terrifying to witness. Our artillery support was the only thing preventing us from being immediately overrun. Shells rained down on the Chinese approach routes, creating momentary gaps in their advance. But there were always more coming. As they closed to within 100 yards, the Chinese began throwing grenades. Most fell short, but enough reached our positions to cause casualties. I heard screams from Marines hit by shrapnel, saw Doc Johnson racing between the wounded, treating them under fire. At 50 yards, the Chinese charge accelerated to a run. "Fix bayonets," Lieutenant Morris ordered. The metallic sound of bayonets locking onto rifles rippled down our line, a sound unchanged since the days of the Civil War, yet still chilling in its implication. We were preparing for combat. The Chinese hit our line like a wave breaking against rocks. In places they broke through, creating desperate pockets of close quarters fighting. I fired until my rifle was empty, then used it as a club, swinging the butt at a Chinese soldier who leaped into our position. The fighting became a blur of faces, blood, and snow. Bobby stood back to back with me, fighting with a combat knife. After his ammunition ran out, Walt Thompson moved along our section of the line, his massive frame a rallying point, plugging gaps where the Chinese threatened to break through. I found myself face to face with the Chinese officer, distinguishable by his uniform and the pistol he carried instead of a rifle. He fired at me, the bullet grazing my temple. Blood poured down my face, half blinding me. I lunged forward with my bayonet, driving him backward into the snow. I could have finished him there, should have, by the rules of war, but something in his eyes stopped me. Not fear, but a calm acceptance of whatever came next. I hesitated just long enough for another Chinese attack to pull me away from him. When I looked back, he was gone, dragged away by his men. That moment would return to me in dreams, for decades afterward. The human wave attack continued for hours. Wave after wave of Chinese soldiers crashed against our positions. Our ammunition ran dangerously low. Men were reduced to sharing rifles, one firing while the other scavenged rounds from the dead and wounded. By mid-morning, our situation had become desperate. Communications with adjacent units were spotty at best. We could hear fighting across the entire perimeter, but had no way of knowing how others were faring. "We need to fall back to the secondary position," Lieutenant Morris ordered after conferring with Walt. "We're too exposed here, and our ammo won't last another assault." We began a fighting withdrawal, leapfrogging by fire teams, one group providing cover while another moved back. The Chinese pressed us hard, sensing our vulnerability. During one such movement, I saw Hank Miller take a bullet to the leg. He went down in the open, exposed to enemy fire. "Cover me," I shouted to Bobby before sprinting to Hank's position. "Leave me," Hank grunted as I reached him. "I'll just slow you down." "Shut up," I replied, hoisting him onto my shoulder in a fireman's carry. Marines don't leave Marines behind. The weight of him plus my pack and weapon made each step through the snow an agony. Bullets kicked up snow around us. I felt one tug at my sleeve, another ping off my helmet. Somehow, we made it back to cover. Doc Johnson immediately went to work on Hank's leg, his skilled hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the chaos around us. "Clean through," Doc announced. "Missed the artery. You're lucky, Miller." "Don't feel lucky," Hank grimaced. We continued our withdrawal, moving the wounded as gently as speed allowed. Our new position was more defensible, with better fields of fire, but our situation remained grim. We were effectively cut off from the main Marine force, our squad and fragments of others, forming an isolated pocket of resistance. The radio crackled to life in George Patterson's hands. He listened intently, then turned to Lieutenant Morris. "Sir, command says all units are to consolidate at Hagaruri. They're organizing a breakout to the south." Maurice nodded grimly. "That's 15 miles from here, through Chinese-held territory." It was then that disaster struck. A Chinese mortar barrage landed directly on our position. The explosions threw me against the frozen earth, the concussion momentarily stunning me. My ears rang, and the world seemed to move in slow motion. When my senses cleared, I saw Bobby lying nearby, blood spreading across the snow beneath him. I crawled to him, my heart pounding. "Bobby, Bobby, talk to me." His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then finding mine. "Jim, can't feel my legs, ... I looked down and felt my stomach lurch. Shrapnel had torn through his lower back and legs. The wounds were bad, very bad. "Doc," I screamed. "Doc, over here. It's Bobby." Doc Johnson appeared through the smoke, already triaging the newly wounded. He knelt beside Bobby, his experienced hands quickly assessing the damage. "I need to stabilize him before we move him," Doc said, pulling supplies from his kit. "These wounds are serious." Lieutenant Morris crouched beside us, his face grim. "We can't stay here. The Chinese are regrouping for another push." "5 minutes," Doc replied without looking up. "That's all I'm asking." Morris nodded once, then moved to organize our remaining forces. I held Bobby's hand while Doc worked, trying to keep my friend conscious. "Stay with me, Bobby. We're going to get you out of here. Always said." Bobby coughed, blood speckling his lips. "Always said you'd have to drag me out of trouble eventually." "Yeah, well, I'd appreciate it if you'd make it a little easier next time," I replied, forcing a smile I didn't feel. Walt Thompson appeared beside us, his massive frame providing some shelter from the wind. "We need to move now," Doc finished, bandaging Bobby's wounds and gave him morphine for the pain. "He needs a real medical facility. The aid station at Hagaruri is our best hope." "I'll carry him," I said immediately. Walt shook his head. "Not alone. We'll take turns. But first, we need to get through those Chinese between us and Hagaruri." Lieutenant Morris gathered our remaining men, 11 of us still capable of fighting, plus 3 wounded, including Bobby. "We move fast, we stay tight, and we shoot anything that gets in our way." "Clear, clear," we echoed. Moving through enemy territory with wounded men was a nightmare. We fashioned crude stretchers from poles and ponchos. For Bobby and the other seriously wounded Marine, a corporal named Jenkins from another squad, Hank could hobble with assistance, his arm draped over George Patterson's shoulders. The temperature remained brutally cold, the wind cutting through our tattered cold weather gear. Bobby drifted in and out of consciousness, the morphine and blood loss making him delirious. I walked beside his stretcher whenever I wasn't taking my turn carrying it, talking to him continuously, afraid that if he fell asleep in his cold, he might never wake up. "Remember that time we stole Old Man Wilson's rowboat?" I asked him, desperation making me grasp at childhood memories. "You said you knew how to row, but you couldn't even keep us straight. We went in circles for an hour." Bobby's eyes flickered open, a faint smile crossing his penetched face. "You ... weren't any better." "No, I wasn't," I agreed, relieved to see him responsive. We were a sorry pair of sailors. Lieutenant Morris led our group, using his compass. To maintain our heading toward Hagaruri, Walt Thompson took up the rear, constantly scanning for signs of pursuit. We moved as quickly as the terrain and our wounded allowed, using draws and depressions for cover whenever possible. We'd gone perhaps 3 miles when we encountered our first Chinese patroller, about 10 men moving perpendicular to our path. They spotted us at the same moment we saw them. Maurice reacted instantly. Take cover. Patterson, Jenkins, get the wounded behind those rocks. What followed was a brief, violent firefight. Our experience and desperation gave us the edge, despite our exhaustion. Within minutes, all the Chinese soldiers were down. We'd suffered no additional casualties, but the noise had surely alerted other enemy forces in the area. We need to move faster, Morris said as we retrieved our wounded. They'll have patrols converging on this position soon. We pushed on, the landscape a monotonous expanse of snow-covered hills and frozen valleys. The sound of distant fighting grew louder as we approached Hagaruri. Flares and artillery illuminated the night sky ahead of us. Around midnight, we ran into our second Chinese force, much larger group, setting up a roadblock on the narrow mountain road leading to Hagaruri. They had a machine gun emplacement and at least 30 men. Morris called us together behind a small rise. We can't go around not with the wounded. We need to hit them hard and fast. Walt studied the Chinese position, then turned to Maurice. Sir, let me take 3 men around their flank. We'll create a diversion, draw their fire. The rest of you punch through the center when they're distracted. Morris hesitated, clearly understanding what Walt was proposing. That's a suicide mission. Thompson, Walt's weathered face showed no fear, only calm resolve. Maybe, maybe not. But it's the only way to get Sullivan and the others through. After a moment, Maurice nodded. Who's going with you? 3 Marines volunteered immediately. I wanted to join them, but Walt shook his head when I started to speak. Stay with Sullivan, he said quietly. Get him home. They left, disappearing into the darkness. 10 tense minutes passed before we heard a tremendous explosion, followed by sustained rifle fire from the Chinese roadblock's flank. Walt and his team had thrown together improvised explosives from grenades and whatever else they carried. Now, Maurice ordered, and we rushed forward, firing as we ran. The Chinese, their attention divided by Walt's attack, couldn't respond effectively to our frontal assault. We broke through their position, the men carrying Bobby and Jenkins moving at a dead run despite their burden. I looked back once, trying to spot Walt and his team, but saw only muzzle flashes in the darkness. The sound of their covering fire gradually faded as we put distance between us and the roadblock. 2 hours later, we stumbled into the Marine perimeter at Hagaruri. Flares illuminated the night, and the sound of sporadic fighting echoed around. The defensive lines, sentries challenged us, then quickly escorted us through when they recognized we were Marines with wounded Doc Johnson. Immediately directed corpsmen to take Bobby to the medical station. I tried to follow, but Doc stopped me with a hand on my chest. Let them work, he said gently. You need rest and food. You're no good to him if you collapse. I stood there, watching them carry my friend away, wondering if I'd ever see him alive again. Hagaruri was a fortress under siege. The 1st Marine Division had consolidated their position, creating a defensive perimeter around the small village and its vital airstrip. Wounded Marines were being evacuated by air when weather permitted, but Chinese forces surrounded us on all sides. I found Lieutenant Morris the morning after our arrival. He was conferring with other officers, studying maps spread across the hood of a jeep. Any word on Thompson and his team? I asked. Morris shook his head. Nothing yet. They're listed as missing in action. I nodded, feeling hollow. Walt had sacrificed himself so we could get through, so Bobby could get treatment. Sullivan's condition, Maurice asked. Stable, but critical. They're prepping him for evacuation on the next flight out if his condition allows. I hesitated. Sir, request permission to remain with him until then. Granted, Morris said without hesitation. But I need you back when he's away. We're not out of this yet. The field hospital was a collection of tents filled with wounded Marines. The medical staff worked tirelessly, despite exhaustion and limited supplies. I found Bobby on a stretcher, pale but conscious. Doc Johnson was checking his bandages. Hey, ugly, Bobby greeted me weakly. Look who's talking, I replied, relief flooding through me at seeing him awake. Doc Johnson gave me a cautious nod. He's holding on. Flight leaves in 2 hours, if the weather holds. I sat with Bobby, reminiscing about home, about the trouble we'd gotten into as kids, about anything except our current situation. Sometimes he would drift off mid-sentence, then jerk awake again, disoriented. "Jim," he said during one lucid moment, his voice barely above a whisper, "if I don't make it, you'll make it," I interrupted. "Listen," he insisted. "If I don't, tell my folks I wasn't afraid. Tell them I did my duty. And tell Mary I'm sorry I won't be coming home to marry her after." "All?" I swallowed hard. "You can tell them yourself when you get back to Medford." He smiled faintly. Always the optimist. When the time came for evacuation, I helped the corpsman carry Bobby to the airstrip. A C-47 waited, its engines running, already. Loaded with wounded, Doc Johnson appeared, supervising the loading of patients. "Doc," I said, grabbing his arm. "Take care of him." Johnson nodded. "I will, but I'm not going with them. My place is here, with the men who can't be evacuated yet." I watched them load Bobby onto the plane, fighting the certainty that I would never see my friend again. The aircraft taxied down the crude airstrip and lifted off, banking away from the mountains where Chinese forces waited. Back at our position, I found what remained of our squad preparing for the breakout attempt. Division had ordered all forces at Hagaruri to fight their way south to Kotari, the next defensible position on the road to Hungnam. "We move at 0800 tomorrow," Lieutenant Morris informed us. "The division will advance in a convoy along the MSR. We'll have tanks, artillery, air support, everything they can give us." That night, the Chinese launched their most determined attack. Yet, on Hagaruri's perimeter, they hit us from all sides simultaneously, trying to overwhelm our defenses before we could begin our breakout. I was at my position when they struck our sector. The familiar sound of bugles and whistles signaled the assault. Flares illuminated thousands of Chinese soldiers advancing through the snow. "Here they come again," Hank said beside me, his injured leg bandaged, but still able to fight from a stationary position. The fighting was intense, desperate. The Chinese knew this was their last chance to destroy us before we consolidated our forces for the breakout. They attacked with suicidal determination, some carrying only grenades strapped to their bodies, rushing our lines to create gaps for their comrades. Lieutenant Morris moved constantly behind our position, directing fire, rallying men, plugging gaps in our line. I saw him take down 3 Chinese soldiers with his pistol when they breached our position near the command post. The battle raged through the night, but the Chinese couldn't break our perimeter. As dawn approached, their attacks weakened, then finally ceased. We had held, but the cost had been high. Many more Marines would not be joining the breakout attempt. As I cleaned my rifle in the gray morning light, Lieutenant Morris approached. "Callahan," he said, "I'm putting you in for a Silver Star." I looked up, confused. "Sir, for your actions during our withdrawal to Hagaruri, you saved Miller, helped carry Sullivan miles through enemy territory, and kept fighting despite your own wounds." He gestured to the bandage on my temple where the Chinese officer's bullet had grazed me. "I was just doing my job, sir." We all were. Morris nodded. "That's why the Marine Corps works, Callahan, because when hell breaks loose, each of us does our job." The breakout from Hagaruri began at 0800 on December 6th. It was a massive operation. Tanks, trucks, jeeps, artillery pieces, and thousands of Marines and Army troops formed a convoy stretching for miles along the narrow mountain road leading south. Our job was to protect the convoy's eastern flank, preventing Chinese forces from attacking the vulnerable column of vehicles. We moved alongside the road, climbing hills, securing high ground, then moving again, a continuous leapfrog of securing and advancing. The Chinese didn't wait long to strike. By mid-morning, they were hitting the convoy from both sides. The column would stop, Marines would deploy to repel the attack. Then the advance would continue until the next ambush. "Keep moving," Lieutenant Maurice urged us during one such firefight. "If we stop too long, the whole convoy becomes vulnerable." The Chinese had positioned snipers and machine guns on the ridgelines overlooking the road. Our air support Marine Corsairs, flying from carriers offshore, made strafing runs to suppress these positions. The roar of their engines and the chatter of their guns provided momentary respite. I remember looking back at one point and seeing the surreal sight of Marines walking alongside vehicles, many wounded, some being carried on stretchers lashed to jeep hoods, all moving south through enemy territory. It was a fighting retreat unlike anything in modern warfare, an entire division refusing to surrender despite being completely surrounded. The temperature remained brutally cold, hovering around 20 below zero. The wounded suffered terribly, their injuries freezing, morphine ineffective in the extreme cold. Doc Johnson worked tirelessly, moving up and down our section of the column, treating casualties, improvising with whatever supplies remained. How much farther to Coterie? I asked George Patterson, who had managed to get an update over the radio. About 6 miles, he replied, but the Chinese have blown the bridge at the Funchalen Pass. Engineers are working on a plan. 6 miles might as well have been 600 in these conditions. Every step was a battle against cold, exhaustion, and an enemy who knew the terrain and had us outnumbered. Late in the afternoon, we were hit hard on the east flank. A large Chinese force had worked their way down a draw, attempting to cut the convoy in half. Lieutenant Morris quickly organized a counterattack, leading our squad and elements of others to push the Chinese back. The fighting was chaotic, hand-to-hand in places where the enemy had closed to grenade range. I found myself separated from the main group, pinned down behind a rocky outcrop by a Chinese machine gun. As I lay there, trying to work out my next move, I saw a familiar figure dash between boulders about 30 yards to my right. Doc Johnson, medical bag in hand, running toward a wounded Marine lying exposed in the snow. The Chinese machine gun shifted, tracking Doc's movement. Without thinking, I broke cover, firing at the gun position to draw their attention. The bullets kicked up, snow around me, but the diversion work. Doc reached the wounded man and dragged him to safety. I dove behind a boulder as the machine gun raked my position. When I peered out again, I saw Doc giving me a quick salute of acknowledgement before turning his attention to the wounded Marine. The fighting continued until dusk. When the Chinese finally withdrew, we rejoined the convoy, which had made painfully slow progress during the engagement. Lieutenant Morris gathered what remained of our squad. "We pushed through the night," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Division wants to reach Coterie by dawn." The march continued in darkness. Men stumbled forward on frozen feet, kept moving by sheer will and the knowledge that to stop was to die. The road was lined with abandoned equipment and vehicles that had broken down or run out of fuel. Some wounded who couldn't be carried were left in these vehicles with volunteers who stayed behind to care for them and provide security, knowing they were likely sacrificing themselves. By midnight, word passed down the column that the engineers had found a solution to the destroyed bridge at Funchalen Pass. An airdrop of bridge sections was planned for the following day. "If we can get across that pass," Lieutenant Morris told us during a brief halt, "we're in the home stretch to Hungnam." Dawn was breaking as the lead elements of the convoy reached Coterie. We'd made it through another night, but our ordeal was far from over. The most dangerous stretch of road, the Funchalen Pass, still lay ahead. The rest of our journey to Hungnam was a blur of cold, fatigue, and intermittent fighting. The bridge at Funchalen Pass was rebuilt using sections airdropped by C-119 flying boxcars, an engineering miracle under combat conditions. We reached Hungnam on December 11th, joining thousands of other Marines and soldiers awaiting evacuation. The port was Kasa, desperate exodus of military personnel and Korean civilians fleeing the advancing Chinese army. Ships of all sizes waited offshore to transport us to safety. I remember standing on the dock, watching Marines carry the wounded aboard, the walking wounded helping each other, no man left behind. I searched every medical staging area for Doc Johnson, hoping to thank him for saving so many lives, including mine. I finally found him tending to a group of frostbitten Marines, his medical supplies long exhausted, using torn strips of his own uniform for bandages. "Doc," I called out. He looked up, his face gaunt with exhaustion, his eyes hollow. "Callahan, you made it, thanks to you." "What happened to you after I saw you at the counterattack?" "Kept working," he said simply. "Too many wounded to do anything else." There was nothing more to say. We clasped hands briefly before he turned back to his patients. I boarded a transport ship on December 13th, watching the Korean coastline recede as we steamed toward Japan. The Chosin Reservoir campaign was over. We had escaped the Chinese trap, bringing out our wounded and our equipment despite overwhelming odds. It wasn't a victory in the traditional sense, but it became a legendary example of Marine Corps tenacity and fighting spirit. Bobby survived his wounds, but lost both legs below the knee. I visited him in the hospital in Japan before being rotated back to Korea for the remainder of my tour. He was pale, thin, but still Bobby. "Guess I won't be trying out for the baseball team anymore," he joked when I entered his room. "Probably not," I agreed, fighting back tears. "But you're alive, which is more than a lot of guys can say." "Because of you, Jim. The docs told me what you did." I shook my head. "We all looked out for each other. That's what Marines do." After Korea, I remained in the Marine Corps, making it a career. Bobby returned to Medford, married his sweetheart Mary, and opened a hardware store. Despite his injuries, he lived a full life, raising 3 children and becoming a pillar of the community. We stayed close through the years, our bond forged at Chosin stronger than any family tie. Walt Thompson and his team were officially listed as missing in action, presumed dead for decades. I imagined him lying somewhere in those frozen mountains, another casualty of a forgotten war. Then, in 1998, at a reunion of Chosin veterans, I met a South Korean delegate who had served as a liaison officer with the Marines in 1950. "There is someone who wishes to contact you," he told me, handing me a letter. It was from the Chinese officer I had encountered in hand-to-hand combat, one I hadn't killed when I had the chance. He had survived the war, become a professor of history, and through veterans organizations had learned my name. He wrote to thank me for the moment of humanity in the midst of savagery, saying it had changed his life. We corresponded for several years before his death in 2003. In his last letter, he wrote, on different sides of a war neither of us started, we found a common humanity. Perhaps that is the only victory worth remembering. Bobby passed away 3 years ago. I gave the eulogy at his funeral, struggling to put into words what he had meant to me and how Chosin had bound us together for life. The Chosin Few, as we survivors call ourselves, gather annually to remember. Our numbers dwindle each year. Soon, none of us will remain to tell firsthand what happened in those frozen mountains in December 1950. That's why I tell this story now. Not to glorify war, there is nothing glorious about watching young men die in the cold, but to honor the courage, sacrifice, and brotherhood of those who were there. Marines, soldiers, Navy corpsmen who faced impossible odds together and refused to be defeated. In the end, that's the legacy of Chosin, not the strategic withdrawal or the military tactics, but the unbreakable bonds formed when ordinary men faced extraordinary challenges together and discover they are capable of far more than they ever imagined.